Psychiatric disorders like binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa are caused by a combination of factors, including social stressors, psychological development, and a person's unique biology. Certain behaviors that trigger binge eating, like dieting, are very common, yet only a few percent of people who diet go on to develop binge eating. Why are some individuals more susceptible to developing binge eating? Genetics may explain why certain individuals are more likely to develop binge eating. Several studies have found that binge eating is more likely to run in families, and large genetic studies estimate that the risk of developing binge eating is about 50% genetic. Can genetics explain why some people develop binge eating and others don't? First, some background on DNA. DNA is like a language, but with only 4 letters. DNA by itself does not do very much, but instead is mainly a source to hold information. DNA specifically provides the instructions on how to make proteins. The part of DNA that makes a protein is called a gene. Proteins are actually what do the work of running the body. Examples of proteins include the hemoglobin in your red blood cells that carry oxygen, or antibodies made by your immune system to fight off infections. A change in the DNA of a gene is called a mutation. Mutations change how proteins are made. Not all mutations are damaging, but if a mutation damages a protein enough, it can increase the risk of having a disease. How do we go about finding the mutations that actually increase the risk of developing binge eating? There are over 20,000 genes. In the past, we were only able to look at one or a few genes at a time to see if those were more likely to be mutated in patients with binge eating. However, modern technology now allows for all 20,000 genes to be sequenced and all the mutations to be identified in those genes. One method is to sequence all of the genes and find out which genes are more likely to be mutated in patients with binge eating compared to a group of patients who do not binge eat. When you conduct an analysis like this, you get a list of genes that looks something like this. This list of genes may look like a bowl of alphabet soup. So how do you make sense out of it? One way to do that is to see if the genes on the list all have a common function. If several genes on the list do similar jobs in the body, then it is very likely that that function is involved in causing the disease. When you conduct this type of analysis, you find several pathways begin to emerge. The first pathway, shared in common by many genes on the list, is called the melanocortin pathway. The melanocortin pathway is a system in the brain that is well known to regulate food intake, metabolism, and growth and development. The second pathway held in common by multiple genes on the list is the incretin hormone pathway. Incretin hormones are released from the intestines after you eat in order to help the body store energy and to tell you that you are full and satisfied. The third pathway involved is the cannabinoid pathway. The cannabinoid pathway is the target of the drug marijuana. But your brain also makes cannabinoids. They're called the endocannabinoids and are well known to regulate food intake. Finally, several genes on the list are all involved in something called peptide hormone processing. Peptide hormones are made from long proteins encoded by genes, and the genes on this list are all involved in helping to turn those proteins into the final peptide hormones, which are involved in their functions. Putting this into perspective, if 100 patients with binge eating were to come in for treatment, about 14 of them would have a mutation in the melanocortin pathway. An additional 19 will have a mutation in the incretin hormone pathway, and an additional 10 will have a mutation in the endocannabinoid pathway. Finally, 21 of the patients will have a mutation in the peptide hormone processing system. In total, over 60% of patients have at least one rare, highly damaging mutation in just 16 genes that are all known to regulate appetite. So what does this mean for our patients? Patients who binge eat are more likely to have mutations in genes related to regulating appetite. Mutations in these genes may explain why some patients with binge eating are more likely to have conditions like anxiety, depression, and ADHD. These results may also explain why some patients respond better to current treatments than other patients do. Finally, some patients with binge eating may benefit from certain medications that regulate appetite.